I'm Chuck Missler, and I have the privilege of having you participate with one of those rare moments in life. You know, we love to fellowship with Christians, and we also like to learn from profound minds, and it's refreshing to have a profound mind that's a Christian join us. And I'm joined in this little chat with a dear friend, Stephen Meyer, and want to welcome you to our little setup here.
Chuck, it's awfully nice to renew acquaintances and to be back with you. Yeah.
And it's interesting for me because I pick up tidbits here and there and I lean on those in our materials, but now I have a chance to have a bona fide, real expert in these areas to ask some questions. And I really appreciate your latest book, The Signature in the Cell. And I think many of us probably, to a fault, take for granted the evidence of design thus a designer. As Christians, we sort of start from that, and in some respects it probably puzzles us to see the apparent ignorance that is articulated by people who presumably have far greater minds than we have in the scientific world. To hold a commitment to intelligent design puts you in a minority, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Although the evidence, as it's stacking up, becomes more and more and more compelling, and the movement of scientists who are seeing this evidence, I think, is growing rather rapidly. So for 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, it has been the conventional wisdom in science that Darwin explained away the appearance of design, the illusion of design. There's not real design, there's just the phony appearance of it that's been produced by this undirected mechanism of natural selection. That consensus, I think, is starting to break up, largely because of what we've discovered in the inner recesses of life, in the smallest unit of life inside the cell. We're discovering this fascinating integrated complexity where you have miniature machines, circuits, and what has fascinated me for now almost 25 years is the discovery of digital code, of information in molecules.
That moves right into my lap. I appreciate that. For our audience, you should understand that thanks to Michael Denton back in 1986 and his book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, that was one of the first that I'm aware of scientists, an evolutionist, that declared in publication that evolution no longer is a viable explanation for what we've discovered about our universe. And then he was followed up by three others, Michael Behe, who sort of introduced this idea of irreducible complexity. And then we have Philip Johnson and Darwin on Trial.
His book, Darwin on Trial, right.
And these minds, not necessarily Christian, just clear thinkers, have just revolutionized the landscape. And one of those, that caliber, is Stephen Meyer in his book Signature in the Cell and so forth. So it's a privilege. You know, it's one thing to have an old friend here. It's quite another to really, you bring credibility to our platform. I appreciate you being here. And I have some questions. See, the minute you start talking about digital codes,
you better be wary of that credibility.
Yeah, I know. That moves into an area that I really have some background
in.
Yeah,
you absolutely do, Chuck.
And the thing that really blew me away is the discovery, for me at least, that the DNA is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. Now, anyone that studied coding probably may not be aware of the fact that designing an error-detecting code is tricky enough. Designing an error-correcting code, there's probably not one engineer in 1,000 that knows how to do that, and yet we find it. Now, I understand, too, this DNA code is in all life, not just mammals, not just human life. It's in tree, it blossoms and leaves. It's everywhere there's life. It's the same code.
Well, there's an important distinction to be made as we use these metaphors of code and text or genetic message. The distinction is between the sequence of the chemicals that function like alphabetic characters in a written language, which we refer to as genes when they code for proteins, and the code that converts that text into a protein. So there's both a text and a code, a symbol convention and an actual genetic text, now, just as we have in a software program or in written language.
And tell our gang a little bit too about this whole business of the non-protein elements, that what used to be called junk DNA, that constituted a significant portion of.
Well, yeah, that's something. In the book, I make the case for DNA based first on what I call molecular biology 101. This is the basic understanding that came first with Francis Crick, that along the spine of the DNA molecule, you have these 4 chemicals called bases that are functioning just like alphabetic letters in a written text or digital characters in the machine code. And I talk about Bill Gates's observation that DNA is functioning like a software program, but much more advanced than any we've ever created. We know from experience that programs come from programmers and that information generally comes from an intelligent source. That's the kind of first pass of the argument. Therefore, the discovery of information in DNA points to an intelligent source. But beyond the information, just the linear array of information, we also have a complex information processing system in the cell that is using that information to construct proteins. And as we learn more about that processing system, we've learned that even the sections of text in the DNA molecule that were thought by the Darwinists initially to be non-functional, nonsense, or what they call junk DNA, turn out to be importantly functional. And overall, the non-coding regions, which make up the vast majority of the genome, are functioning like an operating system in a computer, which is directing the timing and the expression, regulating the use of the other information, the protein coding regions, the data sets that are stored on the DNA molecule. So whereas in the 1980s it was thought that there was a tiny section of the DNA molecule that was the result, that was functional, and the rest was the remnant of the natural selection and random mutation trial and error process, and therefore junk, we now know that almost all of the genome is transcribed, it's all used, and it's all functional, and the non-coding regions are operating like a higher level operating system, which only deepens the richness of the comparison between what's going on in a living system and our own high-tech digital world.
Yeah, am I correct that there's actual editing going on? I mean, the introns and all that? Is that
absolutely? That's part of the information processing system. There's portions of the genes that are snipped out. It's kind of, a lot of it's done on a needs basis. It's one scientist says it's under algorithmic control. There's if-then subroutines going on, so that if the part of the genome that is expressed is the part that is needed given the environmental conditions that the organism finds itself in.
See, for me that has staggering implications, because the difference between a very complex calculator and a computer, and when we say computer, what we really mean to imply is something that is built to what's called the von Neumann architecture. They've had calculators, adding machines, whatever, for years. What made the computer distinctive was that the computer would modify not just data, but it could modify the codes. And that's what we call in the memory you can have data, of course, and you can also have programs, and the computer's ability to modify the programs is what distinguished it from simply a very complex calculator, so to speak. And the fact that that was the big breakthrough from Second World War on, in terms of the emergence of what we call today, and we take for granted today, the von Neumann machine. Well, it's startling to realize that we've got that kind of thing going on. We actually have the sequences themselves being modified by the machinery.
According to the needs of the organism in different environmental contexts, exactly.
And I guess this is where I have great difficulty.
And by the way, von Neumann, you may know, was was profoundly skeptical about Darwinian evolution. And he wrote an important paper in my area called Analyzing the Difficulty of Producing a Self-Reproducing Automata, which is exactly what a living organism is. It's one thing to have a program, it's another thing to have a program, or it's one thing to have a machine, it's another thing to have a machine that can make itself. And what von Neumann did was look at the minimal informational requirements that would be necessary to have a machine that was capable of producing itself. He realized that reproduction of form and function required some kind of code or information to transmit the knowledge that you have, the know-how for a machine to rebuild itself. And as a result of those calculations and his analysis of what would be involved, he said, there's just no way you can get from simple molecules to a self-reproducing automata. And so he was a profound skeptic of Darwinian evolution and these chemical evolutionary theories of the origin of the first life.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I guess let's bring it down to the practical Christian witnesser that knows his Bible to some extent, and he runs it. What is the best way for a layman to communicate and establish this idea of intelligent design, setting aside the university conflicts,
professors and all the the high level.
You fight the battle in a certain domain,
exactly.
But our average listener is going to be just having a cup of coffee with a friend. What is the best armament that he might use to communicate the whole issue of intelligent design?
Well, I think at some level this is not that hard. My dad is a mechanical engineer, and one of the things he taught me was that there are no such thing as really hard problems. There are problems that are an aggregate of simple, tractable problems. And I've taken that approach in communication on this because the basic argument for intelligent design, based on the presence of the digital code that's stored in DNA, is not that difficult to explain. And it runs something like this. I said it a few minutes ago, maybe too fast, but let me just reprise it here, if you don't mind, because it might be helpful for your listeners. The critical discovery was 1957 when Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, realized that DNA was literally storing information in a digital form, that it was his so-called sequence hypothesis. Now, he realized that the 4 characters along the spine of the DNA are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in the machine code. When you think about that for a minute, that's very, very suggestive. When Bill Gates says DNA is like a software program, it is similarly very suggestive. Why? Because we know from experience, from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that information always comes from an intelligent source. A program comes from a programmer, a paragraph in a book comes from a writer, a headline also comes from a writer, information embedded in a radio signal ultimately comes from a human mind. So whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, and this is the key premise, we always come to an intelligence, to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information, in digital form no less, in the DNA molecule, points decisively back to an intelligent designer. A program requires a programmer. That's the essence of the argument. It's very commonsensical. It's based on what we know from our experience. It resonates with what we know based on the information age, and I think young people get this very quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's the basic core argument's not that hard to explain, and you can get it from the book. You can get it. We have some videos at Discovery Institute, one called "Unlocking the Mystery of Life." What I've found talking on airplanes, especially when I run into engineers, or medical doctors, or software people, they get this right away. It's not the question. Next question is not, is this science, or the kind of phony objections that we're encountering in the academic world. The next question is usually, well, who do you think the intelligent designer is? Mm-hmm. You know, they want to get right to the metaphysical question. Sure. So I would not, for the smart lay people, non-scientifically trained or scientifically trained, can I think communicate this basic argument. And then of course one picture is worth 1,000 words when you actually see what's going on inside the cell. That animation that I showed in the lecture that we did is available on my website for the book, and we've done this video, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, that takes you inside. You see the miniature machines. My dad, who's a mechanical engineer, as I mentioned, was a little nonplussed when I left a reasonable, respectable job in geophysics to go study the philosophy of science. And when I came back from grad school, he was asking me questions about what I'd been studying, and I gave him a little slide of an animation still of the bacterial flagellar motor, which Michael Behe was at just that point making famous in his book, Darwin's Black Box. It's a rotary engine. It's inside a cell wall of a simple bacterium, and it's got rotor, stator, O-rings, drive shaft, bushings. Dad, mechanical engineer, looks at it and he tips down his glasses and gets a good look, and he hands it back to me. He says, "Okay, I get it." He's been a big fan of intelligent design ever since. So ordinary folks, I don't think, should despair at all those smart PhDs out there who are going to refute them. I think most people will get this pretty readily. I mean, it's the Romans 1 message that God has made it plain in the things that are made.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things some time ago when I was doing some research to support our Genesis commentary revision, I was startled to discover that God's first jealousy is as creator. His role as redeemer, you need the Word of God to understand that, but the creator, the creation itself, leaves us without excuse. And I was startled to discover that there's a specific judgment by God of a culture that fails to acknowledge him as creator. And that's really what Romans 1, for the last half of that chapter, is all about. And many people read that and don't get it. It's not about an individual decision, it's about a judgment of God on the culture. And I won't get into it more here, it's probably not the right place. But Romans 1 from 18 to the end is a judgment on a culture. And indeed, that's what's so bizarre to me about our scientific culture, is that it is presumably the pursuit of truth, and yet we embed that in a culture which denies the existence of truth. And that contradiction is reaping its whirlwind through our culture.
Well, and it has to do with the terms of engagement that are allowed in the scientific world. Since about the time of Darwin, in the late 19th century, science adopted a new guiding principle, a new rule to guide its investigations. The time of Newton and Galileo and Kepler, they were seized with the notion of design. They had a watchword, or in the period of the scientific revolution, it was intelligibility. Nature is intelligible because it's the product of a rational mind, and therefore we as rational minds can understand it. And that's what makes science possible. And so they presupposed intelligent design as the basis of doing science. They also found specific evidences of it when they went out and did this science. Newton, in his book on the optics, writes about the exquisite way in which the eye is optimized to take advantage of the properties of light, which he says is evidence of an intelligent and powerful being. Same thing in the introduction, the general scholium to the Principia, where he lays out his theory of gravity. He starts by making a design argument about the fine-tuning of the planets and the way they all are balanced so beautifully. But by the late 19th century, we get scientists saying, hey, if you're going to be a scientist, you have to limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations. We can't consider the design hypothesis or the God hypothesis. And so...
that flies so much in the face of our current technologies. We've got the super collider going on where they're trying to probe, but we've got... I was fascinated by this GEO 600 thing, where you've got scientists are trying to find gravity waves, and now they find that the noise that they're encountering may be evidence that the universe is really a hologram. You know, they're clearly dealing in terms that go far beyond replicatable experiments.
Well, and there are this is one of the problems with the claim that intelligent design isn't science. It's fundamentally based on this premise that if you're going to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to materialistic explanations that refer only to material entities.
But see, that's all based on the theory that our physical universe is some kind of an end-all, and then yet we find now scientists concerned because the constants of physics apparently aren't constant, and the implication of that is that our physical reality is but a shadow of a larger reality. Well, the minute, as a scientist, we acknowledge the existence of a reality beyond our own, the limitations, that tends to, it's an inappropriate constraint.
It's exactly right, exactly right. It's the constraint that's the problem, because we'd be content with the majority of the scientific community simply to acknowledge the possibility of something beyond matter and energy as playing a role. But the rules of the debate are set up so you have to, if you're going to be a scientist, you can't talk about intelligent design. You can't talk about anything that involves mind or purpose or intelligence or conscious activity. But what if the kind of evidence you're seeing points to that as the only known cause of that kind of evidence? That's exactly what we think is going on with information. Information always arises from an intelligent source. So if you foreclose the possibility and say, I'm not going to even consider intelligent design, you're going to be beating your head against the same wall for a long time. I mean, imagine the guy...
There's a term for that. It's called denial.
It's called denial. Imagine the archaeologist looking at the Rosetta Stone saying, well, it's got to be wind and erosion. You know, we can't talk about any ancient scribes because those guys would have been intelligence, and we got to limit ourselves to material processes. They would never have come to the true explanation. So in addition to making a scientific case for intelligent design, we're also challenging the rules of science. Michael Behe's got a t-shirt, he says, let's break some rules. Because we think the fundamental obligation of the scientist is not to limit yourself to a set of artificially constrained options, when you're theorizing. It's to follow the evidence wherever it leads to the best explanation, to the one that's most consistent with experience.
Yeah, we find that even in biblical, in seminary terms, because they overemphasize context, and yet again and again and again, the Holy Spirit deliberately indulges in transfers of context. What we would call a pun, and he uses that all the time. And it's interesting. I tangle often with some of my friends on this whole issue of context, context, context. Then they jump into Matthew, and again and again and again and again, he opens his gospel with examples where he takes quotes from the Old Testament out of context to make a point. And it's almost if Matthew's given an assignment to embarrass that excessive commitment to context that is preached so rigidly. Now I've shifted, from the scientific thing into the seminary world, but again, we seem to be victims of the barriers we put up.
Well, the materialistic assumption as being foundational to all good science and scholarship had a profound effect on biblical studies starting in the late 19th century, where biblical scholars adopted the higher critical models that were essentially evolutionary explanations for the origin of the text. Wellhausen and his JEPD documentary hypothesis, that was the idea that you couldn't have a text that old that was recording historical events accurately, so it must have evolved through a long process of accretion, and then we find that the testimony of, say, the patriarchal narratives are spot on with the historical evidence that's coming to light, and there's no way that someone could have known that 100 years after the fact. So the materialistic assumption about the origin of the biblical text, that it was evolved as various editors redacted it had no inspiration or reflection of actual historical events, turns out to be starkly at odds with the actual evidence.
Well, not only that, it's also a form of denying Christ, because Jesus quoted from each of the 5 books and attributed it to Moses, so that the Wellhausen hypothesis is clearly anti-biblical, not just different. It's contradictory, and I'm very indebted to John in John 12, because when I was a young teenager growing up and I was getting into biblical things a lot, and I ran into the Isaiah hypothesis, and I didn't buy it, but I didn't know how to refute it. Well, discovering John 12, where Jesus quotes from Isaiah 6 and from Isaiah 53, and says that same Isaiah said again. He in just one. You see, I'm convinced that that the Holy Spirit has anticipated in advance every conceivable rebuttal people come up with, and the Deutero-Isaiah thing is crisply, cleanly, the rug's pulled out from under it. And the same thing with the so-called documentary hypothesis. But and again, that's one of my preoccupations, is the realization that the whole thing evidences design. Every number, every place name in these 66 books, even though they're spread over 2,000 years by 40 different guys, that there's evidence of design, and that's something you can prove. And then once you prove that, you also come to grips with that design had to originate from outside time. So
it's interesting to me, Chuck, that your background was in engineering, because we've found that as we're making our case for intelligent design based on the evidence in biology, that the people who get it first are engineers, software designers, and medical doctors. The academic biologists tend to be locked into the 19th century mindset of the very qualitative, descriptive approach to biology, and the people that actually design things, or who work on, say, the design systems in the human body, like the medical doctors, they're very, very quick to see that you've got control systems, you've got information processing systems, you have all these elegant ways of solving problems that bespeak engineering.
And to a design engineer, an engineer that's in one of the aerospace firms or whatever, they're very conscious of the fact that design requires coordination, and noise is the enemy. Randomness is the enemy.
Right.
And that's why I have often leaned on a publication when I was at Rand. They, in 1955, published a book called A Million Random Digits. And you show that to a layman and they laugh. It's just a book of random numbers. No, it was considered at the time a major breakthrough, because they used the best computers available at that time to go through that to make sure they were random. And what that means is that they absolutely made sure there was no design, no symmetry, no repeatability, no design of any kind. And they had to spend a lot of energy to really make sure that they would meet the criteria of being random. And what it should communicate to us is that in a spectrum, randomness and design are opposites on a continuum. And to attribute these elegant things that we discover in the body, for example, to anything other than extremely elegant design, to try to ascribe it to the operation of chance is probably the definition of absurdity.
Yeah. Notice too, with the work that you just described, presuppose the ability to detect design. And that makes design a properly, once you, and my colleague William Dembski, the mathematician, in his book, The Design Inference, which was published at Cambridge University Press, contrary to all the people who say that ID people don't have peer-reviewed publications, but that was one of his insights, that design is detectable when there are criteria by which we routinely recognize the products of intelligence in the echo of the effects. And the critical criterion, in brief, is information. It's specified or functional information. And when you find that, bingo, you know mind was responsible. So and what I've done is, in part, develop my own criteria by which we detect design, and in part apply Dembski's to analyzing the DNA molecule and showing that the criteria by which we'd recognize design in any other realm of experience are present in spades in this artifact, in this biological system. And therefore, if we apply the same logic that we would apply if we were doing the kind of analysis that you just described, we'd come to the conclusion that an intelligence had played a role. It's special pleading that you have to do in order to get around the conclusion of design. And that actually takes us back to that rule of reasoning that the scientific community is hiding behind now, to say, hey, we can't talk about this, that's not scientific.
Well, I'm also always amused, I forgot where it first came up, but the story is one of an astronaut that first lands on, say, the planet Mars, and as he walks, he looks through the dust and he pulls out a wristwatch with the numbers and so forth, and what do you conclude from that? You know, obviously that didn't evolve. It meant somebody was there. In other words, somehow confronted with an anecdotal situation like that brings it into focus that there's just no way that a watch with its hands and its ability to keep, just something trivial, could, if you found something like that in a, oh, that's the other thing, by the way, that I think is useful, is the whole issue of the SETI experiments. The
search for extraterrestrial intelligence with the radio telescopes and all that.
Yeah, and the Drake formula. You know, I got interviewed about that here recently. Tom Horn had a thing he had wanted to get into. But the whole idea, they were trying to ascertain the probability of life in outer space. But they used the Drake formula as a way of organizing the debate. And they had 84 of the top scientists gather together and so forth. But what's interesting, as they debate, they're really establishing the uniqueness and the impossibility of design happening by accident.
Yeah.
And it's very...
Because all of the variables in the equation are actually constraints that would have to be met in order for life to arise. And
so it's interesting to read the proceedings, because they inadvertently are building the case that life is unique and distinctive and so forth. But that's where, you know, the other thing I think we both share, the pleasant surprise by the Privileged Planet, it's Gonzalez and Richards?
And Richards, yeah.
That, when I first ran into that, blew me away, to realize that not only was the universe designed for man, the anthropic principle that most of us are familiar with, but the fact that it was designed to be discovered. You might summarize that for our...
Well, it's a fabulous book that came out just a few years ago from Guillermo Gonzalez, who was an astronomer at Iowa State at the time, and a philosopher named Jay Richards, both of whom are also colleagues of mine at the Discovery Institute. And they enumerated all these various fine-tuning parameters that are necessary to create a life-friendly, a habitable planet. And there are an immense number of constraints that are involved. But Guillermo had an aha moment when he was studying eclipses and realized that the same set of conditions that are required for habitability correlate with discoverability, or measurability was the way he put it. Measurability and habitability go together. That is to say that the universe, or the planet Earth is in, just the right distance from the sun in a circumstellar habitable zone, I think is the way they put it. And it's also our galaxies in just the right place within the galactic arm, and to allow for life to be, not too hot, not too cold, not too much radiation, not too close to this, not too close to that. But that same narrow band wherein life can exist, and human life can exist, is also a narrow domain in which scientific observations can be made of a fundamental sort. We're in just the right place in the solar system where we can observe eclipses. Knowing about eclipses turns out to be important for learning about the chemical composition of the sun. Because of that, then we can study things in deep space. We're in just the right place in the galaxy to be able to study things in deep space. Our knowledge, and it just goes on and on. There's numerous things that we couldn't know unless our planet was right where it is in relation to the sun, and our galaxy, and our solar system was right where it is in relation to the wider galaxy.
Yeah, the mathematics of a solar eclipse, the size of the moon, the placement of Earth and Sun, so it literally blocks out the sun except for the corona, which is what led to the discovery of spectroscopy.
Exactly,
which
exactly.
opened the whole field of astronomy.
And chemistry. I mean, spectroscopy, excuse me, is...
And the precision there
Yeah.
is so precise that it, again, couldn't be accidental.
Right.
It was designed to do what? To allow us to discover. And it's a testimony to the mercy of God, I think.
And something, I've make the caveat that obviously not everyone that's developing or defending the theory of intelligent design is a Christian. You mentioned Michael Denton. He's religiously agnostic, but he's was a very important scientist in getting the idea of intelligent design on the table. But I happen to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. And what I like about the Richards and Gonzalez hypothesis is, first of all, it's got a lot of evidence in favor of it, but secondly, it tells you not only that our planet was designed, but it seems to reveal something about the heart of the designer. It seems to suggest that he wants to be known, which I think is a kind of an invitation to relationship, which is exciting.
Indeed, I would agree with you, but even move the decimal point over. I think our designer has deliberately set it up so that all of us are without excuse. We can be excused from a number of other things that we don't know about, but when we're confronted with the creation, there's enough there to hold us accountable, and I think that's the heavy side of that in my mind. But I think that we are without excuse, and I think that's a fundamental. There are a lot of other things that we learn and understand from the Word of God. Okay, great, but the creation speaks for itself.
I have a friend who says it's an intellectual property issue. There's this connection between the word author and author's rights or authority. And that when you were saying that your Bible study had revealed that God takes his standing as the creator rather seriously and holds us accountable to recognize that. My friend has had the same insight. He says it's an intellectual property issue. He made it. Us attributing this to an undirected material process is rather offensive.
Very offensive. Yeah, very much so. I'm looking forward to doing more with you, my friend.
It'd be a lot of fun, and I sure appreciate your opening up your auditorium today for the lecture, and the chance to talk to you is always fun.
You are welcome here anytime, and I challenge you to call my bluff.
Okay.
And we'll be trying to impose upon you to participate in some of our conferences, because it's a refreshing voice, and it's nice to have an actual practitioner, not just someone on the sidelines speculating like I do. You're right there in the heat of the
maybe we can get some of our other guys over here too, talk about that privileged planet. They have a wonderful lecture on that. Gonzalez and Richards do. It's fascinating.
I have the book, and the video is one of the best things I've ever seen. It really is terrific. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Chuck. Great to be with you again.
God bless you.
You too. Way the appearance of design, the illusion of design. There's not real design, there's just the phony appearance of it that's been produced by this undirected mechanism of natural selection. That consensus, I think, is starting to break up, largely because of what we've discovered in the inner recesses of life, in the smallest unit of life inside the cell. We're discovering this fascinating integrated complexity where you have miniature machines, circuits, and what has fascinated me for now almost 25 years is the discovery of digital code, of information in molecules.
That moves right into my lap. I appreciate that. For our audience, you should understand that thanks to Michael Denton back in 1986 and his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, that was one of the first that I'm aware of scientists, an evolutionist, that declared in publication that evolution no longer is a viable. Well, I'm Chuck Missler, and I have the privilege of having you participate with one of those rare moments in life. You know, we love to fellowship with Christians, and we also like to learn from profound minds, and it's refreshing to have a profound mind that's a Christian join us. And I'm joined in this little chat with a dear friend, Stephen Meyer, and want to welcome you to our little setup here.
Chuck, it's awfully nice to renew acquaintances and to be back with you. Yeah.
And it's interesting for me because I pick up tidbits here and there and I lean on those in our materials, but now I have a chance to have a bona fide, real expert in these areas to ask some questions. And that the DNA is a 3 out of 4 error correcting code. Now, anyone that studied coding probably it may not be aware of the fact that designing an error detecting code is tricky enough. Designing an error correcting code, there's probably not one engineer in 1,000 that knows how to do that, and yet we find it. Now, I understand too, this DNA code is in all life, not just mammals, not just human life. It's in tree, it blossoms and leaves. It's everywhere there's life. It's the same code.
Well, there's an important distinction to be made as we use these metaphors of code and text or genetic message. The distinction is between the sequence of the chemicals that function like alphabetic characters in a written language, which we refer to as genes when they code for proteins, and the code that converts that text into
explanation for what we've discovered about our universe. And then he was followed up by 3 others, Michael Behe, who sort of introduced us this idea of irreducible complexity. And then we have Philip Johnson and Darwin on Trial.
His book, Darwin on Trial, right?
And these minds, not necessarily Christian, just clear thinkers, have just revolutionized the landscape. And one of those, that caliber, is Stephen Meyer in his book Signature in the Cell and so forth. So it's a privilege. You know, it's one thing to have an old friend here. It's quite another to really you bring credibility to our platform. I appreciate you being here. And I have some questions. See, the minute you start talking about digital codes,
you better be wary of that credibility.
Yeah, I know. That moves into an area that I really have some background
Yeah,
in.
you absolutely do, Chuck.
And the thing that really blew me away is the discovery, for me at least. I really appreciate your latest book, The Signature in the Cell. And I think many of us probably, to a fault, take for granted the evidence of design as thus a designer. As Christians, we sort of start from that, and in some respects it probably puzzles us to see the apparent ignorance that is articulated by people who presumably have far greater minds than we have in the scientific world. To hold a commitment to intelligent design puts you in a minority, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Although the evidence, as it's stacking up, becomes more and more and more compelling, and the movement of scientists who are seeing this evidence, I think, is growing rather rapidly. So, for 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, it has been the conventional wisdom in science that Darwin explained